Imagine standing on Dorset Street in 1888, where the fog is so thick you can taste the coal smoke and human desperation in every breath. A woman's scream cuts through the darkness, then stops abruptly, replaced by silence so heavy it feels like a physical weight pressing against your chest. This is London's Whitechapel, where survival meant making choices that would destroy your soul piece by piece, and where thousands of women disappeared into shadows that polite society pretended didn't exist. Tonight, we're walking into those shadows, into the hidden world of Victorian brothels, where the truth was far more terrifying than any ghost story whispered in drawing rooms. Mary Kelly had been beautiful once. At 25, you could still see traces of the Irish girl who arrived in London with dreams of respectable employment, perhaps marriage, maybe even happiness. Instead, she found herself in a single room at Miller's Court, earning her living in ways that would have shattered the heart of the girl who stepped off that boat from County Limerick. But Mary's story wasn't unique, it was ordinary. Across Victorian Britain, tens of thousands of women found themselves trapped in a system built on their suffering, maintained by men who used them at night and condemned them by day. Her death finally forcing respectable society to acknowledge, if only briefly, the hell that existed in their midst. These weren't women working in comfortable establishments with regular clients. They were part of a vast underclass that drifted between casual labor, street selling, and prostitution. Women who lived day to day with no safety net except their own exhausted bodies. Women working in established brothels at least had walls around them. Madams who had financial reasons to keep them breathing. Women like Catherine faced dangers that Victorian gentlemen discussed over brandy as if they were talking about weather patterns. Abstract and distant. Certainly nothing that required actual intervention or, God forbid, systemic change. Hannah Colwick kept diaries that survive today as rare testimony to the economic pressures that pushed women toward prostitution. Working as a domestic servant, she earned £12 a year, barely enough for food and clothing, nothing left for emergencies. Her hands bled from scrubbing floors and carrying coal, the back-breaking labor that kept middle-class households functioning while the women who performed it remained invisible. In May 1860, Hannah wrote about Margaret, another servant who'd gone on the streets after falling ill. Hannah prayed daily that wouldn't be her fate, but she understood with terrifying clarity how narrow the margin was between respectability and ruin. One illness, one missed week of work, one moment of bad luck, and any woman could find herself with no choice but the choice between dying slowly of starvation or dying slowly of something else. For women with children and no husband, the situation became impossible. The Poor Law Amendment Act had abolished outdoor relief, meaning single mothers faced a stark choice: enter the workhouse where they'd be separated from their children forever, or find some other way to survive. Many chose prostitution because at least then they could keep their babies. Sarah Wise, a social investigator, recorded the testimony of Ellen, a 28-year-old mother of 3 whose husband had died of consumption. Ellen worked from a basement room in 7 Dials, charging sixpence, roughly what a skilled craftsman earned in an hour. On good nights, she saw 3 or 4 clients. On bad nights, none. The mathematics of survival left no room for the moral luxury that respectable society demanded from women who had nothing. If you're finding value in these hidden stories and understanding the real human cost behind Victorian respectability, please consider subscribing. These aren't just tales from the past. They're reminders of what happens when society treats people as disposable, and that's a lesson that remains painfully relevant. Your support helps us continue uncovering these forgotten voices. Josephine Butler, a feminist reformer born to privilege in 1828, used her resources to investigate what other respectable women refused to see. She visited brothels across Britain, documenting girls as young as 13 working alongside women in their 40s, establishments operating above legitimate businesses with a full knowledge of police and magistrates who chose to look the other way. In 1871, after visiting a high-class establishment in Edinburgh, Butler wrote in her diary about the hypocrisy that astounded her. Downstairs, respectable gentlemen conducted business over brandy. Upstairs, young women, some barely more than children, serviced the sexual appetites of men who would publicly denounce them as fallen creatures. The same men who voted on laws governing public morality by day became customers of vice by night. Victorian society maintained its moral authority through an elaborate system of denial, treating prostitution as an unfortunate necessity that existed entirely outside civilized life, a fiction that required constant maintenance, including laws that criminalized women while rarely touching their male customers. Dr. James Miller worked in London's East End during the 1870s and 1880s, and his medical records tell stories that moral reformers could imagine and would believe if they could. His case notes, preserved in hospital archives, document the physical cost of prostitution with clinical precision that becomes unbearable in its accumulation. Agnes M., 17 years old, admitted in March 1882 with severe lacerations consistent with violent assault. She refused to name her attacker for fear of losing her employment at an establishment on Commercial Street. This was her fourth admission in 6 months. She weighed approximately 6 stone despite average height, malnutrition evident, symptoms consistent with early-stage consumption. Miller treated her injuries, gave her what medicine he could, and sent her back to the same circumstances that had nearly killed her because there was nowhere else for her to go. The women who came to his surgery weren't wicked creatures from moral tracts. They were human beings ground down by circumstances beyond their control, and he could treat their injuries but not the poverty and desperation that brought them there in the first place. Annie Chapman understood these economics better than any social reformer ever would. Born around 1840, she'd been married to a coachman, lived a respectable working-class life until her husband's death left her with nothing. By 1888, she was living in common lodging houses in Spitalfields, earning money through casual prostitution and selling flowers on the street. She needed 4p every night for a bed, and when she couldn't afford it, she slept in doorways, vulnerable to weather, police harassment, and predators. On weekends, when working men had money to spend, she could sometimes earn enough to pay for several nights in advance. During the week, she might go without shelter for days. The uncertainty aged women rapidly. Timothy Donovan, deputy keeper of Crossingham's lodging house, remembered Annie as quiet, never any trouble. Always trying to pay her way, though sometimes she'd be short. On those nights, he'd see her walking toward Hanbury Street, looking for business. She was getting older, he testified later, and the work was getting harder for her. The night of September 7, 1888, Annie couldn't raise the 4p. She'd been ill for weeks, suffering from what residents described as consumption and chronic stomach problems. Donovan found her in the kitchen around 2 in the morning, clearly unwell and without money for a bed. He seemed reluctant to turn out a sick woman in the middle of the night, but the rules were the rules. Annie wrapped a thin shawl around her shoulders and told him she'd be back soon. She walked into the darkness of Dorset Street and was found murdered 6 hours later in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street. The second confirmed victim of Jack the Ripper. But Annie's death, shocking as the brutality was, represented just one tragic endpoint of circumstances that trapped thousands of Victorian women in cycles they could unescape. Margaret Harkness, writing under the pseudonym John Law, spent months in 1887 living among the women of London's East End. Her investigations revealed how Victorian society's harsh treatment of unmarried mothers created vulnerabilities that brothel operators could exploit. She documented informal networks where women working in established brothels acted as recruiters, approaching desperate women in workhouses and lodging houses. The process wasn't always obviously coercive. Often it was simply offering solutions to immediate crises. A woman named Emma told Harkness about meeting Lily in the workhouse, how Lily knew a place where Emma could earn enough to rent a room and keep her baby daughter with her instead of losing her forever to the workhouse system. When Emma figured out what kind of work was meant, it still seemed better than the alternative. This was how the system perpetuated itself, not through force but through the absence of any bearable choice. Within Victorian brothel culture, an elaborate hierarchy existed. At the top were expensive establishments in St. John's Wood or Regent Street where well-dressed women entertained wealthy clients in luxurious surroundings. These houses operated with semi-official protection, paying bribes to police and local officials. Mrs. Jeffreys, who ran high-class establishments in Chelsea and Marylebone during the 1870s and 1880s, employed women who could pass for respectable middle-class ladies. Her brothels featured elegant furnishings, excellent food and wine, entertainment that might include piano, music, or theatrical performances. Clients paid premium prices for the illusion of seducing virtuous women rather than purchasing commercial sex. But even these luxurious establishments operated on fundamentally exploitative principles. Women typically owed substantial debts to madames for clothing, room, board, and medical care. Debts calculated at inflated rates that could take years to repay, while accruing interest that kept women in permanent bondage. Alice Mitchell worked in a mid-tier brothel in Pimlico during the 1880s, and her diary, discovered after her death in 1894, provides intimate details of daily life in such places. In October 1883, she wrote about Rose, a new girl who arrived, hardly more than a child, maybe 16 at most. Rose said her family had died of fever, that she'd been on the streets for weeks. Mrs. Henderson took her in, gave her a bath and a proper dress. The girl thought she'd been saved. She didn't understand yet what was expected. Alice remembered feeling grateful once too, before she learned what gratitude cost. The truth is that Victorian brothels existed because Victorian society needed them to exist. They served as release valves for a system that denied women economic independence, legal rights, or social power. They allowed respectable men to maintain the fiction of virtuous wives at home while using desperate women elsewhere. They let politicians and moral reformers rail against vice while doing nothing about the poverty that created it. And when women like Mary Kelly, Catherine Edos, and Annie Chapman were murdered, society briefly pretended to care before returning to the comfortable fiction that these women had chosen their fate, that their suffering was somehow separate from the respectable world's prosperity, that their deaths were tragedies but not indictments of the system that killed them long before any murderer ever could. The fog lifted eventually from Dorset Street. The gas lamps were replaced with electric lights. The rookeries were torn down and rebuilt, but the fundamental equation remained the same for far longer than we'd like to admit. Women with no options, men with money and desire, and a society that profited from pretending not to see the transaction. What strikes you most about these stories? Is it the cruelty of the system, the resilience of the women who survived it, or the fact that so many of these economic pressures still exist in different forms today? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. These aren't just historical curiosities, they're reminders of what happens when we decide some people's suffering is acceptable, and that's a conversation worth having.